While the rest of us are busy perfecting AI, there is a group of people still living in the backdrop of the Ice Age. This is the world's last remaining portal to the prehistoric past, and it's still wide open. It's the only place on Earth where you are an outlaw simply by existing. Out here, your human rights, your passport, and your insurance mean absolutely nothing. The moment you cross that invisible 5-mile buffer zone, you step outside the protection of the civilized world. To the modern world, you effectively vanish. To the islanders, you become a target. And here's the craziest part. The Indian government, which technically owns the territory, won't come to your rescue. Even worse, they won't prosecute the people who kill you. North Sentinel Island is part of the Andaman Archipelago. It's Indian territory, but it exists in a legal gray zone. It's not a nature reserve, and it's not a restricted military base. It is a sovereign territory under protection. Essentially, India acts as a global bouncer standing at the door saying, "Don't go in there if you want to live, and don't bother the people inside." Why such a hardline stance? Why can't we, with all our drones and special forces, just land there and civilize the place? The answer is biological. To the Sentinelese, we aren't just strangers. We are walking biological weapons. A common cold or a basic flu virus, things your immune system handles daily, would be the Black Death for them. We protect them from us just as fiercely as they protect themselves from the world. If you think these are just primitive tribes who accidentally got stuck in the Stone Age, you're looking at it all wrong. The Sentinelese might actually be the most successful civilization in human history. Why? Because they've survived where everyone else failed. Look at the science. Genetics and anthropology tell us they are direct descendants of the first wave of humans to leave Africa. Think about that. Roughly 60,000 years ago, this group reached these shores. While our ancestors were fighting Neanderthals, taming horses, building pyramids, inventing gunpowder and launching rockets, these people were just living. They survived the Ice Age. They watched the sea levels rise and fall as the very shape of the continents shifted. They outlasted the fall of empires, world wars, and global pandemics, all without even knowing they existed. They are so genetically isolated that their DNA is a literal time capsule. It is the raw, undiluted code of humanity as it was at the very dawn of our species. They have no agriculture. They don't know how to start a fire, though they can keep one going if lightning strikes. They don't practice metallurgy, at least not in the way we understand it. And yet, they are incredibly healthy. In the rare, long-distance footage captured by anthropologists, we see fit, athletic people with zero signs of malnutrition or genetic decay. They are perfectly synced with their ecosystem. They are living proof that progress isn't a requirement for survival or for happiness. Now, let's look at this logically. We like to imagine that if we showed up to a primitive tribe with flashlights, antibiotics, and mirrors, they'd fall to their knees and hail us as gods. We expect them to be awestruck by our power. But the Sentinelese don't bow down. They pick up their bows and shoot to kill. Why? Why is it that to them, a modern human isn't a deus ex machina or a savior, but a demon to be eliminated on sight? There's a concept in psychology called generational trauma. We assume they're aggressive because they're savage. But what if their hostility isn't a sign of being primitive, but a perfectly rational, hard-earned defense mechanism? Imagine if, a long time ago, beings that looked like humans entered your home and brought nothing but pain, abduction, and death. Imagine that lesson was so horrific, it became etched into your culture for centuries. The Sentinelese don't just dislike us, they fear us the same way we would fear an invasion of parasitic aliens. And the most chilling part? Their fear is completely justified. The history of their contact with the outside world didn't start with handshakes. It began with an act of unspeakable cruelty 140 years ago. That was when a British officer decided to play scientist, and in doing so, he effectively poisoned the well for any peaceful contact for the next century. Next, We're going to look at that fatal encounter in 1880. You'll see how one ambitious man named Maurice Vidal Portman inadvertently turned an entire tribe into the most fierce xenophobes on the planet. Believe me, after hearing this story, you'll stop blaming the Sentinelese for their violence. You'll realize that their arrows aren't just weapons, they are the only cure for us. But before we get into the kidnappings and biological disasters, let's ask ourselves, if they're so isolated, how did they learn to turn our trash into weapons? There's no iron ore on their island. The answer lies in the reefs surrounding the island, where the rusting hulls of shipwrecks still sit. A gift from another world. A gift that taught them how to kill us even more effectively. Are you ready to find out how civilization accidentally armed its own enemies? Let's dive in. To understand why any attempt to land on North Sentinel Island today is met with a hail of arrows, we have to travel back to 1880. This was an era gripped by colonial fever, where the British Empire felt it was its divine right to catalog every square inch of the globe and every subject of the crown, whether those subjects wanted it or not. In January of that year, a warship dropped anchor off the island's coast. On board was a man whose name is forever etched into history as the architect of a fatal mistake. Maurice Vidal Portman. A young, ambitious British officer, Portman was the newly appointed administrator of the Andamanese settlements. But he wasn't just a soldier. He fancied himself an amateur anthropologist, obsessed with the idea of civilizing the world's isolated tribes. His method was simple and fueled by Victorian arrogance. Arrive, seize specimens, take them to Port Blair for study, dress them up, feed them, and then return them to their people so they could spread the word about the wonders of British culture. When Portman's armed search party hit the beach, the Sentinelese did exactly what they still do today. They vanished into the dense jungle. The British spent days scouring the island, finding only smoldering fires and empty huts. Finally, they struck what they considered gold. Deep in the forest, they stumbled upon 6 islanders who hadn't been fast enough to escape, an elderly man and woman, and 4 young children. To Portman, this was a scientific triumph. To the Sentinelese, it was an alien abduction. These people were forcibly dragged onto the ship and transported to Port Blair, the administrative heart of the islands, where the British had essentially established a human zoo. This is where biological fate intervened. Having lived in total isolation for tens of thousands of years, the Sentinelese were an immunological blank slate. They had zero exposure to the common bacteria we live with every day. Almost immediately after arriving in the city, the elderly couple fell ill. Their immune systems, perfectly tuned to the flora and fauna of their island, were utterly defenseless against urban infections. They withered away right before Portman's eyes. Within days, both adults were dead, likely killed by a simple respiratory infection or a common flu, something that would be a minor inconvenience to us, but was a lethal biological poison to them. Portman panicked. The death of his specimens wasn't part of the plan. It looked like a failed mission. In a desperate attempt at damage control, he made a decision that, in hindsight, seems like absolute madness. He ordered the 4 terrified, and likely already infected, children to be loaded with gifts and dropped back off on the island. Imagine the scene through the tribe's eyes. Their elders had disappeared along with the children. Now, the children return alone, carrying strange, frightening objects and an invisible reaper. The children were almost certainly carriers of the virus. We don't know the exact death toll that followed their return, but if the history of other Andamanese tribes is any indication, such contacts often wiped out 90% of a population within a few short years. Years later, Portman wrote in his journals with a rare moment of colonial self-reflection. Their association with us has brought them nothing but misfortune, and it is a matter of great regret that any more contact should be made with them. It was a confession of guilt, but the damage was irreversible. For the Sentinelese, This encounter was the patient zero of their collective trauma. They burned a lesson into their culture that has lasted for generations. Contact with the clothed outsiders means abduction and death. If you want to survive, you don't let them get within a spear's throw. Despite their isolation, the Sentinelese didn't stay entirely in the Stone Age. Fate handed them a resource they were never meant to have. The island is ringed by treacherous coral reefs that have been snagging unwary ships for centuries. And in 1981, one of those wrecks changed everything. A freighter called the Primrose, carrying a massive shipment of hay, ran aground during a storm. The crew thought they were safe until dawn broke. That morning, the captain looked at the shore and saw 50 men armed with bows and spears already building canoes to board the ship. The crew was terrified. The captain radioed a frantic SOS, reporting that the wild men on the beach were preparing for a full-scale attack. A rescue helicopter plucked the sailors off the deck at the very last second, just as the Sentinelese boats were closing in. But the ship remained. And for the islanders, the Primrose became an accidental iron mine. A people who had only ever known bone, stone, and charred wood suddenly had access to high-grade industrial steel. For decades, they made salvage runs to the rusted hull, stripping away plates and metal parts. They taught themselves cold forging, hammering the steel into shape with stones. Today, their arrowheads are forged from the scrap of that ship. They've become exponentially more lethal, using the technology of a civilization they despise to defend themselves against that very civilization. This creates a unique geopolitical standoff. Today, the Indian Coast Guard patrols the perimeter, but their job isn't to force a friendship, it's to enforce a border. For decades, the Indian government tried to find a way in. In the 60s and 70s, this turned into a bizarre, almost surreal social experiment. Scientists, led by anthropologist T.N. Pandit, would leave various items on the beach to gauge the tribe's reaction. These expeditions captured some fascinating, often confusing behavior. For example, when researchers left live pigs, the Sentinelese speared them and then buried them in the sand. They didn't eat them. It was a clear message: we don't want your food. When they left plastic buckets, they eagerly took the red ones but threw the green ones away. Every interaction was like walking a tightrope. The Sentinelese might watch the researchers' boat for hours before suddenly letting an arrow fly. It wasn't random violence, it was a precise control of distance. They allowed us to look, but they never allowed us to stay. The closest we ever got was in 1991, when Pandit managed to get close enough to hand over coconuts directly. For a few minutes, the ice seemed to be melting. The world saw footage of Sentinelese men standing unarmed in the surf, accepting food. It looked like a breakthrough. But the Indian authorities quickly realized this triumph was a disaster in the making. The more contact they had with outsiders, the more signs of disease appeared. Even worse, the Sentinelese began demanding gifts more aggressively, starting to lose the very self-reliance that had kept them alive for millennia. Pandit himself later admitted the tribe was in danger of becoming beggars. In 1996, India made a hard, final choice. They walked away. They ended all missions and declared the island a total no-go zone. Any further contact was officially recognized for what it was: potential ethnocide. This ban became the shield that saved them from the fate of their neighbors, the Onge and the Jarawa, who, after being civilized, were devastated by alcoholism, land displacement, and cultural erasure. The Sentinelese remain the only ones who kept their sovereignty intact. But what happens to such an island when the planet itself turns against it? When the 2004 tsunami, one of the deadliest in history, tore through the Indian Ocean, the world held its breath. The epicenter was so close to the Andaman Islands that many feared North Sentinel had been wiped off the map. But what rescue pilots saw 3 days later shattered our perceptions of primitive people. The tribe hadn't just survived. They were standing on the beach, bracing for a war with the sky itself, aiming their bows at the helicopters above. The era from the 1960s to the 80s was a period of the Great Probing. After decades of accidental and often bloody encounters, the Indian government decided it was time to finally peel back the curtain. This mission was led by anthropologist T.N. Pandit, a man who spent decades trying to bridge the gap without ever speaking a single word. It was a surreal game of psychological chess. Imagine a heavily armed Coast Guard cutter anchored near the reefs, while a group of scientists in shorts rowed toward the shore. They never dared to step into the trees. They knew that was a death sentence. Instead, they left strange objects on the sand and retreated to a safe distance, watching through binoculars. This wasn't just a gesture of goodwill. It was a high-stakes experiment to find the limits of a mind that had seen nothing but its own shores for 60,000 years. The results were both haunting and fascinating. Their reactions defied our logic. When researchers left plastic dolls, the Sentinelese didn't play with them. They buried them in the sand. To a tribe living on the edge of survival, a lifeless object that looks like a human is either a corpse or a demon, a bad omen to be hidden away. They did the same with live pigs. Instead of throwing a feast, they speared the animals and buried them next to the dolls. It wasn't a hunt. It was a cleansing of their territory from an alien infection. They were demonstrating absolute autonomy. They didn't need our protein, and they certainly didn't need our plastic versions of ourselves. Then there was the bucket test. Pandit left buckets of different colors on the beach, and the results were a masterclass in survival psychology. The Sentinelese were obsessed with red. They snatched up red buckets with excitement, but green ones were often ignored or thrown back into the surf. In a dense tropical jungle, green is the background. It's the color of nothing. Red, however, is the color of ripe fruit, the color of blood, the color of danger, and the color of a resource. It was the first time our worlds truly overlapped. We realized they valued utility and visibility above all else. By 1974, the world's obsession with the last savages reached a fever pitch. A National Geographic crew arrived, intent on filming a masterpiece. They tried the gift-giving game again: coconuts, cookware, even a tethered pig. But this time, the tribe decided their patience had run out. A warrior stepped from the shadows of the forest. Without a word or a warning, he let an arrow fly. The director, who was hoping for an award-winning shot, took a broadhead straight to the thigh. The peaceful contact turned into a panicked retreat. That day produced one of the most iconic images of human resistance: a Sentinelese warrior standing triumphantly on the shore, brandishing his bow against the horizon. His eyes didn't show curiosity. They showed the cold rage of someone whose home was being turned into a backdrop for a TV show. It was then that National Geographic realized these people had no price at which they were willing to sell their privacy. But the most massive gift from civilization arrived in August 1981. During the height of the monsoon season, the Panamanian freighter Primrose, carrying hay from Australia, slammed into the reefs. 28 sailors were trapped in a steel cage in the middle of a raging storm. At first, they felt relatively safe, but when the fog cleared the next morning, the captain saw a nightmare through his binoculars. On the beach, just a few hundred yards away, 50 men were gathered. They weren't just watching, they were building boats and rafts right on the sand, preparing for a boarding party. It was a scene out of a fever dream, a modern steel giant about to be swarmed by Paleolithic warriors armed with spears. The crew spent days in total terror, with the captain radioing for weapons to defend the deck. Ironically, they were saved by the same storm that wrecked them. The waves were so massive that the tribe's fragile canoes couldn't break through the surf. That storm bought the Indian rescue helicopters enough time to evacuate the crew under the watchful, hostile eyes of the forest. The Primrose remains there to this day, rotting in the surf. Its rusted carcass, looking like the ribcage of a prehistoric whale, is still visible on satellite imagery. But for the Sentinelese, this wreck wasn't a monument to a maritime failure. It was a gift from the gods, a literal iron mine. In the decades following the crash, they made repeated salvage runs to the ship, stripping away its steel skin. It was because of the Primrose that the tribe finally transitioned from the Stone Age to the Iron Age. They never learned to smelt ore, but they mastered the art of cold forging, hammering scraps of Panamanian steel into lethal arrowheads that would eventually be aimed at anyone daring to disturb their peace. It is a striking paradox. The Sentinelese use our most advanced materials to keep us at bay more effectively than ever. They don't reject progress, they filter it, taking only what helps them defend their borders. As you look at the wreck of the Primrose through your smartphone screen, remember that somewhere on that shore, someone is sharpening a piece of that very steel, looking up at the steel birds in the sky without a hint of fear. But what happens when the sky itself decides to tear their world apart? In 2004, a massive tsunami ripped through the Indian Ocean, erasing entire cities from the map. Most experts were certain the Sentinelese were gone. Yet, what the pilots of the rescue helicopters saw changed everything we thought we knew about human instinct. The tribe hadn't just survived, they met their saviors in a way no one else did during that horrific year. They weren't waving for help, they were standing their ground, bows drawn, ready to fight the very heavens that had just tried to drown them. This defiance was the culmination of decades of tension. By the early 90s, the situation around North Sentinel Island had reached a breaking point. After years of coconut offerings and cautious observations from a distance, the wall of absolute hostility finally cracked. On January 4th, 1991, something occurred that anthropologists still describe as a miracle. The first and only instance of truly peaceful contact. On that day, a boat carrying T.N. Pandit and a young researcher named Madhumala Chattopadhyay approached the shore. But instead of the usual hail of arrows, they saw something incredible. A group of Sentinelese, men, women, and children, walked out of the trees to the water's edge. They were unarmed. They weren't shouting threats. They were simply waiting. Madhumala Chattopadhyay became the first woman to ever make contact with the tribe. She later recalled how she began tossing coconuts into the water one by one, and the Sentinelese began wading out to collect them. Eventually, the gap closed entirely. The researchers jumped overboard, standing waist-deep in the water alongside people who, just the day before, would have killed them on sight. There was no handshake, no protocol, no long speeches, just the silent exchange of fruit. It was a moment where history seemed to hold its breath. Two worlds, separated by 60,000 years of evolution, touched fingertips over a coconut. If you analyze the rare footage from that 1991 encounter, you see a group that is remarkably disciplined. They weren't fearful or submissive. They moved with a calm curiosity, backed by a steel-hard sense of boundaries. One warrior is seen touching the boat, examining the material it's made of. But the moment the bags of coconuts ran out, the atmosphere shifted instantly. One man drew a knife, forged from that same primrose steel, and made a clear, unmistakable gesture. The party was over. Peace was only possible on their terms, and only as long as the ritual of exchange was respected. So why did it all stop? Why didn't we build schools or hospitals? The answer is a grim mix of medicine and ethics. By the mid-90s, health officials analyzed the fate of other Andamanese tribes like the Jarawa, and the results were devastating. Those who embraced civilization were hit by measles and flu epidemics that wiped out half their population. The survivors became state-dependent, losing their skills, their culture, and their dignity. The Sentinelese have no immunity to the background noise of our modern virology. To them, a researcher's common cold isn't just an illness, it's a biological weapon that could end their story in a matter of weeks. We realized that the greatest act of humanity we could offer was to simply leave them alone. In 1996, the Indian government made a historic decision that set a global precedent, a policy of eyes on, hands off. All attempts at contact were officially banned. A 5-mile exclusion zone was established around the island, patrolled by the military. We finally realized that our curiosity was their death sentence. We chose to protect them from ourselves, turning the island into a kind of biological vault, and then throwing the key into the ocean. This decision created a unique legal and moral paradox. The tribe lives within the territory of a sovereign state, yet they remain entirely autonomous. They pay no taxes, carry no ID, and are not subject to the criminal code. If a Sentinelese warrior kills an outsider who has trespassed onto their land, India does not file charges. We have effectively recognized their right to use lethal force to protect their sovereignty. It is the ultimate form of respect for another's freedom, the absolute right to be left alone. But this isolation raises a question. How do they handle the challenges thrown at them by nature? We've been conditioned to believe that modern technology is our only insurance policy against catastrophe. We have satellites, early warning systems, and seismographs. They have nothing but sticks and stones. On December 26, 2004, an event occurred that should have wiped this tiny tribe off the face of the earth. A massive earthquake, reaching a magnitude of over 9.1, struck the Indian Ocean, triggering a tsunami of colossal proportions. A wall of water several stories high slammed into the coasts of Thailand, Sri Lanka, and Indonesia, claiming over 200,000 lives. The Andaman Islands were at the very epicenter of the disaster. The world was certain that the Sentinelese, living on a low-lying island, had been swept into the sea. When an Indian government helicopter flew to the island 3 days later, expecting only to document the tribe's extinction, the pilots couldn't believe their eyes. They expected a wasteland of broken reefs and debris. Instead, as the helicopter hovered over the shore, a warrior emerged from the dense, seemingly untouched jungle. He wasn't waving for help. He wasn't signaling for rescue. He drew his bow and fired an arrow at the steel bird, demanding that it leave immediately. How did they do it? How did a people with no instruments predict a disaster that killed hundreds of thousands of civilized humans? It became a puzzle for scientists. While we relied on deep-sea pressure sensors that failed us, the Sentinelese were reading the book of nature, a language we've long forgotten. Hours before the first wave hit, they felt the shift in the Earth's vibration, heard the frantic calls of birds, and watched the strange behavior of the sea life. Their ancestral knowledge, passed down through hundreds of generations, gave them the only answer that mattered: head for high ground, deep in the heart of the island. It turns out their primitivity is actually a form of hyper-awareness, sharpened over millennia. They survived where modern warning systems proved useless. That arrow fired at the helicopter in 2004 was the most powerful signal they could send to the world. We don't need your help. We've handled this ourselves. Leave us to our own time. Yet, while nature proved powerless against their will, human arrogance and fanaticism continued to look for loopholes. The next major incidents would show that sometimes, even the most well-meaning faith can turn into the darkest kind of evil. This brings us to the story of two fishermen in 2006 who made a fatal mistake, and the missionary John Allen Chow, whose quest for souls ended in a tragedy that forced the entire world to look toward North Sentinel Island once again. December 26, 2004, will forever be remembered as one of the greatest natural disasters in modern history. The earthquake triggered waves that erased entire cities. With the Andaman and Nicobar Islands sitting right next to the epicenter, experts were unanimous: the tribe was dead. The logic was simple. A group living in beach huts stood no chance against a 5-story wall of water. It was assumed a 60,000-year-old chain of human history had been broken in an instant. But reality had other plans. 3 days after the disaster struck, the Indian government dispatched a Coast Guard helicopter for a damage assessment. The pilots expected to find a lifeless wasteland of uprooted trees and smashed coral. But as the machine hovered over the coastline, what happened next was what anthropologists would later call a triumph of instinct over technology. Out of the dense green canopy and onto the blinding white sand stepped a lone warrior. He wasn't begging for food, he wasn't crying for help, and he wasn't waving for a rescue. He raised his bow and loosed an arrow directly at the multi-ton iron beast in the sky. That single image, a tiny human silhouette against the infinite ocean, challenging the pinnacle of modern engineering, went viral across the globe. The tribe hadn't just survived, they had kept their pride and their aggressive independence intact, even in the face of the apocalypse. How was this possible? While our seismographs were recording tremors and our early warning systems were failing across the basin, the Sentinelese knew hours in advance that the ocean was coming to kill. The scientific explanation for this miracle lies in the tribe's profound, visceral connection to their ecosystem. After 60,000 years of isolation, their senses and their culture have become fine-tuned to the slightest shifts in the world around them. Several factors saved their lives. First, a biological sensitivity to infrasound. Animals and birds feel low-frequency ground vibrations long before humans do. The Sentinelese, whose survival depends on tracking game, read the warning signs instantly. When birds abandoned their coastal nests en masse for the deep forest, the tribe knew it was time to move. Then there was the receding tide. To an untrained tourist, the sea pulling back hundreds of yards is a curiosity. To a Sentinelese elder, it's a death sentence. Their oral tradition, passed down through countless generations, taught them exactly what those signs meant. Get to high ground. While the civilized world bet everything on satellites, the Sentinelese were reading the data stream of the forest itself. They reached the island's highest point long before the first wave hit. It proves that their knowledge isn't savagery. It's a hyper-efficient survival system that proved more accurate than any supercomputer. But surviving the tsunami didn't make them any more welcoming to uninvited guests. If anything, it reinforced their belief that the outside world was a purely malevolent force. In 2006, an incident occurred that forced the Indian government to finally admit the island was a kill zone for any outsider. Two Indian fishermen, Sundar Raj and Pandit Tiwari, were illegally poaching crabs in the Andaman archipelago. That night, while they slept, their makeshift anchor gave way, and the current slowly drifted their boat toward North Sentinel Island. By morning, other fishermen spotted the boat aground, but the men were gone. The Sentinelese had found the sleeping poachers. According to their law, any breach of the border is a capital offense. Both men were killed on the spot. But the most revealing part of this story is what they did with the bodies. For years, pop culture was obsessed with the myth that the Sentinelese were cannibals. The 2006 incident put that to rest once and for all. The islanders buried the fishermen in shallow graves on the beach. They didn't eat them, they simply disposed of the intruders like biological waste defiling their land. When the Indian Coast Guard tried to send a helicopter to retrieve the bodies for burial on the mainland, the pilots were met with an unprecedented barrage of arrows. Tribesmen stood on the shore in organized units, firing with lethal precision. The downwash from the rotors nearly flipped their canoes, but they didn't flinch. Eventually, the mission was scrubbed. The government decided that the risk of losing more lives wasn't worth the recovery of the bodies. This case cemented the island's status as a place where no law exists except the law of the forest. The Indian government released an official statement essentially saying the fishermen were responsible for their own deaths for violating the exclusion zone. It was a unique legal precedent, a modern state effectively recognizing a prehistoric tribe's sovereignty and their right to kill those who invade their home. The Sentinelese became the only people on the planet successfully winning a war against the rest of civilization. But while some crossed the border out of greed, one man decided to cross it to save their souls. His name was John Allen Chow, and his story would become the final, tragic chapter in the modern world's attempt to reason with the island. By 2018, the world had become a global village. We've grown used to the idea that every corner of the planet is just a tap away on a smartphone, and social media creates this comfortable illusion that there are no secrets left. But it was during this time that North Sentinel Island issued a chilling reminder to humanity. There are borders that cannot be crossed, regardless of your intentions, even if you believe you are bringing eternal salvation. The protagonist, or more accurately, the victim of this story, was 26-year-old American John Allen Chau. Chau wasn't your typical thrill seeker. He was a missionary with a singular, blinding obsession. For years, he had been training for one goal: to land on the shores of the world's most isolated tribe and preach Christianity. He took survival courses, trained as an EMT, and even practiced living in isolation. But beneath all that preparation lay a fatal blind spot. Chau believed North Sentinel Island was Satan's last stronghold, and he felt it was his divine duty to dismantle it with the Word of God. In his pursuit, he ignored Indian law, international protocols, and the most basic logic of biological safety. His journey to the island began with a criminal act. Chau knew perfectly well that the 5-mile exclusion zone was a hard boundary. He bribed local fishermen with 25,000 rupees to ferry him toward the reefs under the cover of night. He documented the journey in a diary that would later become the primary record of his final days. In it, he wrote of his terror, his divine calling, and the flickering fires he could see on the shore. The same fires the tribe has kept burning for thousands of years. The initial attempts at contact played out like a scene from a low-budget tragedy. Chau paddled his kayak toward the beach, shouting, "My name is John, I love you, and Jesus loves you." The response wasn't a hug. It was a hail of arrows. During one approach, a young boy from the tribe fired an arrow that pierced the waterproof Bible Chau was holding against his chest. Any rational person would have seen that as a final warning. Chau, however, wrote in his diary, "God saved me." He retreated to the fishing boat, terrified and weeping, yet his fanaticism proved stronger than his instinct for self-preservation. On November 17, 2018, John Allen Chau ordered the fishermen to leave him on the shore alone. He was walking toward his death, leaving his notes and belongings behind on the boat. The fishermen, watching from a distance, later testified to a horrific sight. They saw the warriors dragging the American's body across the sand with a rope tied around his neck before burying him in the dunes. John Chau became another victim of the island, but his death sparked an unprecedented international firestorm, raising questions that modern civilization still struggles to answer. This is where we encounter a unique legal paradox. Under any modern legal system, this is a homicide. Yet, the Indian government not only refused to charge the Sentinelese, but also abandoned any attempt to recover Chau's body. Why? Because North Sentinel Island exists beyond the reach of any earthly court. India officially recognizes that the tribe lives by its own laws. Any intervention, whether an investigative team or a recovery mission, would lead to more bloodshed and violate the tribe's sovereignty. We have de facto accepted that there is a place on this planet where our laws aren't worth the paper they're written on. But the most critical part of the John Chau tragedy isn't his death. It's what he risked without even realizing it. Chau believed he was carrying salvation, but in reality, his body was a biological time bomb. As someone with medical training, he should have understood that his own microflora was a death sentence for a people whose immunity hadn't been updated in 60,000 years. A single sneeze, a drop of saliva on a gift, or even the Bible he clutched to his chest could have triggered a flu or measles epidemic that would have erased the Sentinelese faster than any weapon ever could. John Chau was willing to sacrifice himself, but he had no right to sacrifice an entire people. His actions represent the ultimate form of modern hubris, the belief that one's own values and faith are more important than the survival of an entire biological and cultural phenomenon. By killing Chau, the Sentinelese weren't just defending their land, they were defending their lives in the most literal, biological sense. They neutralized the carrier before the infection could take hold. Today, Chau's story serves as a grim reminder that our world isn't as unified as we like to think. Between us and the Sentinelese lies a chasm of perception. Where we see salvation, they see death. Where we see savagery, they see order. Perhaps the best thing we can do for them, and for ourselves, is to accept that this glass should never be broken. The island must remain a closed book, because if we ever finish reading it, we will have destroyed the very story it contains. When you look at satellite imagery of the island today, you realize the Sentinelese are the last guardians of human history. They hold secrets we have long forgotten. And as long as their arrows continue to fly toward our helicopters and boats, we can take a strange kind of comfort in knowing that there is still a place on Earth that cannot be bought, rebranded, or saved against its will. This is the end of our timeline, but for them, it is just another day in an infinite cycle of survival that began long before the pyramids were built, and one that will continue as long as we find the strength to simply leave them alone. When H.G. Wells wrote The War of the Worlds, he ended it with a brilliant and terrifying twist. The invincible Martians, with their heat rays and tripods, weren't defeated by human guns, but by Earth's bacteria. For the Sentinelese, we are the Martians in this story. We like to think of ourselves as the pinnacle of creation, but to this tribe, we are walking reservoirs of death. Over 60,000 years of isolation, their immune systems have become a sterile fortress. Their world has no measles, no flu, no chickenpox, not even the common Staphylococcus bacteria we carry daily. They lack what biologists call immunological memory for the modern world. The scientific reality is stark. In any modern population, the HLA, human leukocyte antigen genes, responsible for recognizing viruses, are incredibly diverse, the result of centuries of plagues and pandemics survived by our ancestors. For the Sentinelese, this genetic toolkit is likely extremely narrow. What we experience as a minor cough would trigger a cytokine storm in them, a state where the immune system panics and begins to destroy its own lungs and organs. To step onto their beach is to unintentionally commit an act of genocide. They aren't just fighting for their territory, they are fighting for their very existence against an invisible enemy they cannot even see. Do you see the irony? We can send a rover to Mars and back, sterilizing every single millimeter of its surface to ensure we don't contaminate another planet. Yet we cannot guarantee that a single careless breath from an anthropologist wouldn't turn North Sentinel Island into a mass grave. Our civilization is essentially a biological wildfire, and this island is the last dry patch of land that the flames haven't touched. That's why the 5-mile exclusion zone is more than just a line on a map. It is a biological quarantine, and crossing it is tantamount to genocide. Every time the Sentinelese pop up in the news, the internet erupts in a predictable debate. People ask how we can just leave them there in the Stone Age, or point out that they have no modern medicine and die from basic infections. This is the classic anthropocentric trap. We instinctively assume that our way of life, with our antibiotics, high-speed internet, taxes, and skyrocketing rates of depression, is better by default. But let's look at the reality of what we're offering. We call it progress, but for the indigenous people of the Andaman Islands, it has been a disaster. The great Andamanese tribes, who were civilized by the British in the 19th century, plummeted from thousands to just about 50 survivors. Those who made it through lost their sense of purpose, became dependent on government handouts, and were devastated by alcoholism. In contrast, the Sentinelese live in a state of perfect ecological balance. They don't have a climate change crisis, a disaster we created. They don't have landfills or crushing economic inequality. They possess a form of psychological sovereignty that we can barely imagine. They are quite literally the only people on Earth who don't know what the global South is, what the exchange rate is, or what a nuclear threat looks like. They are entirely free from our collective madness. Do we really have the right to crash into their world and tell them their way of life is wrong? To force antibiotics and social media accounts on them? Forcing progress on an unwilling population is the ultimate form of colonial arrogance. Through their resistance, The Sentinelese are telling us that what they have is enough. And perhaps that is the wisest answer humanity has ever given to the question of why we exist. When we look at the Sentinelese, we are looking into a mirror. These aren't savages. They are us, exactly as we were before we invented agriculture, currency, and borders. They are a living archive of the human race. They prove that you can thrive for tens of thousands of years without ever needing to invent the wheel. They keep their history in songs and rituals that haven't changed since mammoths still walked the earth. They don't have the internet. They know their neighbor's face, not their avatar. Their social network is limited to 50 people, but those connections are deeper and more vital than any digital bond we've ever forged. In the end, North Sentinel Island isn't a place that needs saving. It's a place that needs to be respected. They have survived the rise and fall of every empire we've ever built. And if we can find the grace to simply leave them alone, they might just outlast our own civilization too. They remind us of everything we've lost in our frantic race for speed and comfort. We traded the hush of the forest for the roar of the concrete jungle, and the clarity of the night sky for the sterile glare of LEDs. The Sentinelese are the control group in the grand experiment we call humanity. By looking at them, we finally see the true price we paid for the right to call ourselves civilized. Think of North Sentinel Island as a priceless artifact sitting behind an impossibly thin, invisible pane of glass. This glass isn't a physical barrier, it's our own conscience. It's our ability to restrain our own relentless curiosity. We could shatter that glass in 5 minutes. We could land a task force, fly drones into every hut, and catalog their every breath. But the very second we do, the artifact turns to dust. The value of the Sentinelese lies entirely in their inaccessibility. Their defiance is a gift to us. Every arrow they loose at our helicopters is a confirmation that there is still something on this planet that cannot be bought, hacked, or rebranded as a tourist attraction. They are the last sentries of our species' original state. Their existence is the only guarantee we have that the world hasn't completely become flat, identical, and predictable. As long as they are there, Earth remains a mystery. In 2026, we are used to the idea that everything has a price tag and everything can be upgraded. But North Sentinel Island is the one place where progress has been officially declared persona non grata. And that is exactly how it should be. We must leave them alone, not because we are afraid of them, but because we respect them. Real respect isn't the urge to teach. It's the grace to allow someone else to be different, to be free from us. The next time you look at the night sky and wonder about other worlds, remember that one exists right here in the Bay of Bengal. There, people fall asleep to the sound of the tide, having no idea we are even talking about them. They aren't waiting for our salvation, and they aren't looking for our approval. They are simply living. Guard their silence, because in that silence, we can still hear the echo of our own distant childhood, a voice we can only catch if we finally stop pounding on their door. See you in the future, or the past. But for now, leave North Sentinel Island in peace. Sleep tight. Now you know where our power ends and where true freedom begins.
you.